Any general thoughts about events we want to mention real quick?
Thoughts of what?
Any events? I don't know. Yeah, I've heard some really good kind of political conversation before we've started the last 2 weeks. I just wondered.
Oh, there's lots of politics to talk about.
Always, yeah.
Some of my friends, people were asking, what's your class about? I said, faith, politics, and I can't remember. Really? I said, no, it's not politics what you think. I said, this is not what you think.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's. I said we talked about Hitler.
There's some correlations. I think.
Well, there is, but I mean, they thought we were just talking about,
Yeah.
Biden and.
Yeah.
Names shall not be named. So I said, no, it's not.
Yeah. It's unfortunate that's when we think about politics that it's about that kind of really shallow layer of stuff. But there's. Particularly because one of the nice things about getting into the philosophy behind it is that there's a long tradition here and there's a lot of depth to it that we're doing a disservice to with these kind of conversations that we have today.
Yeah.
But I mean the conversations are also because we stopped talking about these things. We stopped thinking about them and reading about them, and so all of our conversation is around this surface layer stuff, and it's a mess. And we'll get into a little bit of that. At a philosophical level today, but anything else?
I was actually glancing at a book by Madeleine Albright on fascism,
Mm-hmm.
and it really parallel a lot of what you were talking about. It's kind of scary to read.
Yeah, it's deeply concerning. I think there are a lot of differences that we see that would be going on today in America versus other points in history and even points today in other areas. But yeah, there's that movie that came out recently that's called Civil War, and the fascinating thing about it is that it does not touch on the actual political situation at all, which is somewhat frustrating. And because of that, though, like you miss a lot of the layers of some of the ways that it would play out very differently compared to the previous American Civil War and other civil wars around the world right now that you could really dive into and do some interesting things with. I mean, just in the sense of, I was just thinking about, I mean, my wife and I are probably going to move back to Texas sometime soon, and it's like, what's that going to look like? And that's one of those nations in that movie that secedes with California. That makes no sense whatsoever politically, but like, you have all of these multinational corporations and stuff that you have to do business with on some level to have a functioning economy. And either there's going to be a minimal level of ties that remain, so society is going to look fairly similar, or it's going to break and you have a completely different situation economically, which people aren't going to be happy with one way or another. And there's a lot of elements to those things that could have been really dealt with in depth, and that was a pretty unfortunate take by that film, but they're interesting things that are different than any other circumstance that we could look at in history. With a huge economic world power potentially undergoing civil war would be very different, and the fact that every single state, the division is not between states; it's between urban and rural areas, which it's different. It's very strange. Anyways, so yeah, the rise of fascistic thinking is terrifying, in many ways. I have developed my philosophical approach within this context. I mean, I actually I was pretty much apolitical and only thinking about elements of faith until 2015. And really, honestly, it was in the Republican primaries, and I heard Marco Rubio say that we need more janitors and fewer philosophers. And I just finished my Master's of Divinity, and I was like, okay, well, I guess there's no place for me then, cool. But yeah, then it got worse, so I don't know. That was Rubio. That would have been the better candidate. Oh, it was a mess. Anyways, okay. Well, thank y'all for being here. I'm happy to have a little bit more conversation around things like that, particularly if you see them weave into what we're talking about. Last time, I completely overestimated how much time, what we'd be able to get through. This is going to be much briefer on my end and much more room for conversation. Actually, this time, I'm not lying, so that's good. All right, so this time we're going to deal a little bit with some of the stuff that we left off with last time, with these interactions between ethics and our thought, or political theology proper, with reference to that Carl Schmitt guy that we'll get into pretty quickly, and relating to the philosophical foundations of modern democracy. We started at the earliest beginnings last time, so you already have all that, so we don't have to go back through it all, but we'll keep it in mind as we move forward, and I'll show you some of those key terms just to refresh your memory here. I'm not going to go through them all again, but all of these phrases will kind of come up within the conversation today, or all of these terms. So keep those in mind, and we can come back to this if you want to look at them later on. So let's open up today with a few questions. So I want to give you a second just to read through some of these, and we'll talk about them together. Actually, we'll start one at a time. So what does it mean to be a human being? So take a moment and think about that, and I do kind of want to hear an answer. We're going to think about this from this kind of philosophical perspective, where it's a part of philosophy to answer this question, but maybe it's not something that you would just off the cuff have an answer to. So take a moment and think about it, and I would love to hear some responses. Just on that first question first, I should have, but that's all right. What does it mean to be a human being?
One of a group.
One of a group? Okay, how do you mean group with that?
Mankind.
Okay. So thinking as kind of a species almost. Okay. So with this, when we're thinking about this philosophically, what does that mean then? So if you're looking at this group of, essentially looking at it from a certain angle, animals that are different from others by being human beings, what is it that makes them human as opposed to something else?
I would say a struggle between being a self and being together.
Okay. A struggle between a sense of self or an individual and this kind of togetherness or greater body. Okay. And is that something that differentiates humans from other creatures? And if so, how?
In Western thought, humans are the only sentient beings, but Eastern thought would disagree with that.
What do you mean by sentient?
Sentient.
Sentient. Sorry.
The ability to think in abstract.
Okay. So in fact, so the idea of that kind of sensory element would be something that would be, so even thinking about, jumping to Aristotle for a second. So Aristotle is going to have room for sensation and responses to environment that would be sentience, and yet he's going to distinguish humans in another way with another term. So we wouldn't have a problem with saying a dog can understand certain commands and can receive stimuli from its environment, even going all the way down to even a fly. A fly can recognize things happening around in its environment. So that's the element of sensation, but we would say that that's not the same thing as human beings. Typically, not everybody, including Eastern thought and a lot of current, particularly new materialist kind of thought, are making those distinctions as well, or breaking down those distinctions between humans and other animals. But maybe traditionally then, what would be, rather than sensation, what is the other kind of capacity of human beings that separate them from other animals?
I was thinking good and bad.
So yes, the ability to be able to differentiate between good and bad. What do we use to differentiate between good and bad? What is this? Reason, rationality, mind. Excellent. Yeah. So going back to the early Greeks and moving forward, other than a few outliers, and thinking in Western thought rather than Eastern thought, which is an inherent bias. But yeah, that's this distinction of being able to reason through things.
Who gives the right to be good or bad?
Say that again?
Who gives other people, how do I know you're good or bad?
That's something that we have to determine, right? I mean, so one of those difficulties is that my understanding of that might be different from yours, and how do we...
It'll be different across the world.
Right, Right.
It's free will too, to be good or bad.
Yeah.
Okay, so human beings are rational and have free will. Okay. Other things. Thinking from a Christian context, how might you describe what a human being is?
Person with a soul.
Okay, a soul. What do you mean by soul? I'm going to ask you all these annoying philosophical questions.
It goes down there a little farther about having purpose, and just a relationship with the greater, with some kind of being out there, whether it's the universe or nothing, and the soul is just your being.
Okay. Other thoughts? Is there maybe a passage of scripture that you would go to be able to start to define what a human being is? Interesting.
Image of God wasn't, really the image of.
Yeah, Imago Dei, or image of God, has been one of those traditional kind of returning points. And in fact, as we go in in ancient understandings and then moving on into the modern era, and a lot of emphasis in the modern era, that image of God comes up repeatedly. One of the guys we talked about last time, very briefly toward the end, was Descartes. And Descartes, when he's thinking about this subject, this individual who is a thinking individual that we're building knowledge upon, he in fact references specifically, and he's thinking through this process and saying, I, as a human being, I reflect the image of God specifically through reason, free will, and creativity. So that shapes the modern era as well. Even as there's kind of a move to distance from that kind of theological background of it, there's also this ability to be able to say this use of reason separates us from other creatures, and also it is how we become better human beings that we'll get to here. So do human beings have an ultimate end or purpose, and if so, what is it? I'm interested in just kind of general thoughts on this now that we've kind of dug into this really deeply with the first one, but...
To go to heaven?
Interesting.
To be our purpose, ultimate purpose, to your end.
Oh, so end here. So end or purpose. Does anybody know the term that relates to, coming from a philosophy background? So this actually is the Greek word telos, which means end or purpose, not in the sense of an end of a sentence, but as an ultimate driving factor that makes what one is ultimately what you are, right? So it's an end in that sense, rather than, although philosophically over the years it has been read in both directions in some fascinating ways, such as with the existentialist philosophy of Martin Heidegger. But end here is meaning, what am I ultimately trying to accomplish? What am I here for? So that's what we mean by end there.
From a Christian point of view.
Not necessarily. I think even from a Christian perspective, to get to heaven is fascinating, because that smacks to me of a pretty recent kind of evangelical emphasis, as opposed to how do I live, and how do I live toward whatever this is that we're calling heaven. Like those are kind of different things, but yeah, that's an interesting thing. I'll just want to say a little bit for a second there. Traditionally, going all the way back to Augustine and prior to Augustine, there would be a sense then of a revelation of what is to come, whatever is the end of the universe, thinking time-wise end, and what is going to be this new creation. If you have a glimpse of that, then that tells you how you should live toward that, and that would guide you to being someone who's going to be acceptable in that new creation at the end of time. So those are definitely deeply interrelated, and even brings up that kind of time end sense. But yeah, not that wasn't just what I was going for. Yeah. Any other thoughts? Oh, sorry.
As humankind, isn't it to just perpetuate the species?
Okay, we'll talk about that here in a second. Yes, that would be one view of that. Reproduction itself is something that you can view as the end or purpose of humans. But would that differentiate us from animals? No, I mean, not essentially, and that brings up other problems, but we'll deal with that here to say the least. Other thoughts?
I suppose it's the relational part of that too. One has but I'm not sure whether that would also relate to whether or not there would be a greater being
So you mean
driving or encouraging us.
relational, say what you mean by relational just a little bit more.
Well, having some commitment to others rather than just simply isolating oneself.
Okay, so we might call that,
Well, I suppose it goes to the next question in terms of what makes a good
Yeah.
or just society is in terms of whether or not one is having empathy for other beings rather than just doing their own thing.
okay. Yeah, we'll come back to that, particularly how you phrase that of how relating to others. We'll get there a little bit later today, but excellent. So going back to kind of the what does it mean to be a human being? So we have kind of rationality, and we have reproduction could even be a part of it, and we'll complicate that, and an understanding of good and bad, and something about being social within that. Which we could also say that doesn't necessarily differentiate us from animals either, because we could see that in dolphins and elephants and apes and all kinds of things. But
Maybe
yeah.
a good question is, if you see a lion kill a wildebeest, you don't call that murder. If you see a man kill if you see a human kill another human being, you call that murder. Why?
Yeah.
It goes back to what it means to be human, right? There's some sort of moral aspect built into free choice, right, and free will that differentiates us. Our ability to reason and our ability to choose implies a moral code of some sort, in a way. And it obligates us towards our fellow human beings in a different way than, say, animals relate to each other. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that absolutely tracks. So let's get into this just a little bit. So what makes a good and just society? How would you define that? So empathy, we've got that. What else?
People who help other people.
Okay.
And try to teach other people how to be better, how to nurture each other.
Okay.
Agreement on some rules or guidelines or laws.
Okay. What else?
Goes into self-protection of the group.
Okay.
There are different services given.
Okay. So protection and services offered that, so if an individual has some kind of problem, they can rely on the group in order to take care of those needs. Okay.
I think something about either setting or honoring boundaries.
Okay. Yeah. Setting and honoring boundaries. Do you have an example of what you'd be looking for there?
Well, we live in a townhome, we would go to the next one.
Okay.
We only have ours. We wouldn't say, well, we can go to yours too.
Right. And in order to enforce that, you set a law, and then you give someone the power to enforce that law. Okay. So we're building in this direction here. So is there, and what is, if there is, a sense of human nature? And I'll give you a few definitions here, and if we don't have any initial thoughts, I'll kind of walk through some of these.
Well, I think it really depends on how anxious human nature is.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I think the more anxious, there's a more survivalist. The less anxious, there's a tendency to be more togetherness.
What do you think it is that would tamp down that anxiety?
My dad spanking me?
Your dad spanking you gave you less anxiety?
Less?
That was not my experience of being spanked as a kid.
That would dampen down me. In terms of, just, I mean, a lot of what I'm watching is, there's just a lot of anxiety in our system, and it seems like that anxiety just goes, well, we've got to take more, as opposed to respect others.
I'd like to throw fear in there too.
Yeah, that's I mean, what's interesting about bringing up anxiety is that that word specifically has a lot of weight in existentialist thought, and particularly Soren Kierkegaard, who's a huge influence on me. But yeah, anxiety. It's a better translated, or a better term for it would be angst, sense of deeper kind of struggle with what is. Yeah.
What lessons it is just, harmony and tranquility and those kinds of elements, agreement among people. It lowers it. You don't have it if there's nothing to fight about.
Right. Yeah, and all of those points of history, we can look back and say, hey, those are those points where we didn't have anything to fight about. That was a joke. Never mind.
There are moments.
Brief, yeah,
I
brief.
think about at home. Sometimes my wife and I aren't fighting. So.
There you go. I feel like I shouldn't comment. All right, move on.
Oh, you don't
Yeah. Okay, so a few of these ideas real quick. So I'm starting with the modern era here, and then we'll look back at Aristotle and circle back to some of those things we were building last time to get to some specific conclusions. But Hobbes and Locke are both modern thinkers that have these conceptions of what human nature is, and that is the building block from which they describe how a modern sense of politics should be. So this phrase, bellum omnium contra omnes, does anybody know what that translates to? War of all against all. I bet you're familiar with that phrase. So Hobbes understands the state of nature as this war of all against all. And he comes up with this theory of sovereignty to get through that. So this idea that you're just walking through life and you're trying to get what you need, but you're constantly threatened by someone who is bigger, faster, stronger, etc., who will take what you have and leave you in ruin or dead. And that's the state of human nature. In order to get out of that, people come together and they give up one of these kind of basic elements of what is given to us as human beings, and that is our free will over life and death. And you give over your decision of life and death to a sovereign who then is able to decide what is and is not a threat to the group. And then that sovereign can come together, it can decide and say, you must sacrifice your life, risk your life for the whole against this threat. And that's the essential sense of sovereignty. So when you see that concept, I know that we had a couple nice little references thrown out last time of you've got a fighter jet going into foreign area, and they're entering into sovereign airspace. That's what it means. It's entering into, and now you have a threat, and that threat will be met in order to protect the sovereign nation. So even though this is Hobbes going all the way back to the 16th century, it still matters today in international politics and domestic politics, as we'll see as we go. Locke, on the other hand, John Locke, has this understanding of human nature as we are not essentially trying to tear each other's throats out like Hobbes saw, but we are free and equal and self-sufficient as individuals. And this leads him to argue that we come together as society. The purpose of society for him is that we can do more together. And so there is a certain sense of, yes, you are still giving over to a sovereign for elements of protection, but you should have a say in how you are governed and the laws that are passed. And this is the essential aspect of modern democracy with this concept of the consent of the governed. And of course, that was one of the primary concerns with the Declaration of Independence, because what's that phrase? They were against, they had a problem with
The king.
taxation
Right.
Without
Without
Taxation without representation. And specifically, that means you are being taxed, but you don't have a say in that tax. And it had to do with a bunch of issues of parliament and not giving the colonies a voice, along with a lot of other things, specifically the French and Indian War. We won't get into that. But so that's a concept that comes up and is a huge part of American society from John Locke. What I want to get at here is that there's what is left out of this kind of political structure is there's a more positive building element that describes society itself that is kind of left out of these kind of broad understandings of political theory. But Aristotle got to it very early on, and it continues to have ramifications today, and it's a particular problem for thinking about it within modern democracy, and we'll get into that. But Aristotle is going to think about human nature, as I described earlier. So he has these really specific distinctions between animals and humans, and we could talk more about that. I won't get into the weeds here because I did that way too much last time. But he has this understanding of stages of development, even with a specific species or whatever. But really what sets humans apart is not reproduction, because we take part in that, but that's something that's shared with animals. But the process of reasoning and using language in order to define good and bad and establish justice is what sets humans apart. And getting back to what Reverend Jerry said about that sense of morality, that's going to enter into that space of what is specifically human. And in fact, we'll come back to this phrase later, but does anybody know the phrase from Aristotle that man is a blank animal? I ask you a Jeopardy question here. Anybody know? Man is a political animal, specifically. So he actually argues that humans are meant to come together in this kind of social cooperation, and ultimately that is how we reach what he will say is the purpose of being a human being, which he defines as the good, or the greatest good, the greatest known good for us as human beings that we can see anywhere in the universe. He refers to with this phrase in Latin that is, he didn't say it in Latin, but the phrase that we pick up later in the tradition from the Latin, which is summum bonum, the greatest good. And the greatest good comes about through the polis, through the city of these people coming together and building something through this pursuit of reason. But this also has some problems to it that we'll see here. So, as I showed you last time, Aristotle's understanding of the universe and the individual and the city all kind of work within these concentric circles. This is his overall cosmology, but you could have the same structure and compare the human soul, the human person, with a body on the outside and the mind on the inside controlling the actions, and then the will be somewhere in there as well. And then you have the city that's around this central small group of people who are making decisions, and others that are moving outside of this central part that's making decisions and determining what those motions will be. But the problem with this is that there's a sense of reason, of going all the way to what is ultimately real, with the sense of this Greek understanding of God as this kind of unmoved mover, or this kind of chain that gives us reason, and this understanding that orders the entire universe. We can understand it, and one must understand it in order to take part in the city and to take part in the human good. But what we see in the modern era is there are now all of these different competing understandings of what that good is. And how do we, just like you brought up earlier, how do we deal with someone who has a different understanding of what the good is, and what is good and bad, and what our purpose is? And one of the reasons I brought up the Crusades last time is that we see within that a recognition of, we have this understanding coming from this historical perspective of Christendom after the fall of Rome, of we have this revelation from God that we believe is true. This is how things must be. This is the good. And now there's a competing group that is finding success, that is not using our text, that are not using understanding of the good, but is following the Prophet Muhammad and the Quran, and challenging this understanding. And then there's not only this tension, but this also leads to further tension in Europe and finding all of this difference that must be eliminated. It must be eliminated, starting with multiple instances of Jewish people being kicked out of different lands, and then different heretical groups being attacked and destroyed. They all have to be ferreted out because everybody must agree on what is ultimately true. And once we get to the modern era, this understanding of how we know what is true flips. So rather than hearing it from top down within a hierarchical society where you are seeking answers from the church and from tradition, now in the modern era, with that turn to beginning with the individual subject, the individual thinker, now we're deciding that for ourselves. And what do we do with those disagreements? So describing the problem that we've already touched on a little bit, but thinking about it in philosophical terms here. So let's go ahead and get into a little bit. I want to introduce you to this idea of political theology. So Carl Schmitt, we've mentioned him in previous weeks. He was a political philosopher, a Nazi jurist, and author of a bunch of texts, but particularly I'll look at the concept of the political and political theology. So he is going to emphasize a return to Hobbes' theory of sovereignty. And specifically what is happening during this time is that there's a move more and more toward trying to create or establish these universal rational principles that will determine our politics for us. Or even more so after World War II, relying on economic forces to make those kind of political decisions rather than this different concept which we'll get into. So he partially quotes from Hobbes in making this statement: the sovereign is he who decides on the exception. And what that means is, even if you have a parliamentary or representational democracy, there are going to be times where someone must step in and say, this is a threat, and it must be opposed or destroyed. And this is getting back to Hobbes' key understanding of sovereignty and what he's going to pinpoint as kind of what is the meaning of political theology is this decision. It's not something that is rationally decided. It's not something that we can use science to prove or establish for us, but it's something that we must simply decide. So the comparison there, again, both with Hobbes' understanding of sovereignty, he's comparing it with God, and then saying, you know, the Leviathan, and not to bring up a concept that maybe is a little bit too intricate, but Hobbes is describing the sovereign or the state as this beast that is larger than humans but less than God. But ultimately, because it is only less than God alone, that it must be the highest form of power for a given society. So he's making this particular critique of modern liberalism because there's this essence of decision that has been removed from it. The problem with this is that it's that kind of rhetoric immediately is applied within the Nazi movement to determine an enemy that is inside the state, and they move to eliminate it. First by deportation, and then by, of course, the final solution. And that's not just Jewish people, primarily Jewish people, but also gay people, people of differently abled, gypsies were also systematically murdered.
So when you're saying exception, that they would be the exception, is that what you're saying?
Yes, and so within that framework, what that would be saying is, and so to lean on the horrible rhetoric, it's saying that these people are threatening the state, and therefore the state has to treat them as an enemy. And when the state treats someone as an enemy, they kill them. Yeah, and you can take this down to really basic terms of this gets to the sense of violence that is just beneath our politics always. I mean, you might have a sense of, oh, I have freedom of speech and all of these things, but if you break the law and you're ardent about it, eventually the police will come to your door and they will stop your activity one way or another. And if you resist hard enough, they will use force, the highest level of force.
But you're also, in this, you're also assuming that the sovereign are creating the law.
No. So part of that then is the exception. Sorry, not just, that was a little direct. So.
I think it was right. I'm sorry.
So Parliament will be making the laws, and then the sovereign. So that's the normal situation, not yet effed up. But the sovereign is going to decide that these are not normal circumstances, and that something needs to be fixed. So within the concept, we've talked about this very briefly with the Weimar Republic, but basically their parliament was constantly just completely stalemated. And it led to a lot of problems. And so you had these certain emergency powers that would allow for the chancellor to suspend parliament and make decisions directly. I believe that's right. That might be the president. I get those mixed up. Sorry. But yeah, so basically there's these kind of exceptional times that work slightly differently than this concept from Hobbes, but it's the same basic principle. This is not a normal circumstance, and we're going to pause, and someone who has ultimate authority is going to lay things out so they can begin again. This same basic concept, and in fact the source of the word fascism, is I think it's pronounced fascis. I think that's what it's pronounced, but basically it's this collection of wood, and it actually goes back to the Roman Republic. And at one point there was a man named Cincinnatus who was given these kind of emergency powers within the Roman Republic to fight off the I believe is what they're called. Their name, Aki? Sorry, it's been a minute. But basically, so he's given these dictatorial powers over the Roman Republic, and he fights them off. He leads them in battle. Then he makes a few deals to help his family, and then he steps back and gives the power back to the Republic. So that's kind of the key principle behind it. And in fact, there is an individual who is referred to as the American Cincinnatus. Anybody ever heard of that? George Washington. George Washington, following the American Revolution and the failure of the Articles of Confederation, he is sought out as being America's first king, and he rejects it. We talked about this very briefly. We looked at some of the really problematic things prior to World War II. We saw that Madison Square Garden rally, where it was that huge American Nazi meeting in, 1930? Anyways, I don't remember that date off the top of my head. But they focused on Washington because he's seen as this potential dictatorial figure. And basically they're rereading American history and saying he should have taken those powers. But yeah.
Isn't the real scary part of this is the kind of philosophical framework that, like, Project 2025 is built upon? I mean, if you start looking at the particulars of that particular plan.
I'm going to push against that for now, but I would love to bring that back here in a little bit. What I'm about to work toward is seeing something really problematic potentially, so give me a second, but there's going to be some truth in what Schmitt is saying while recognizing the real risk and problems of what he's saying at the same time. And what it's going to come down to is the confrontation between our understanding of liberalism and our understanding of democracy. And we'll move forward with that now. So this is just to give another sense of political theology, going back to Schmitt here. So he writes, all significant concepts of the modern theory of the state are secularized theological concepts, not only because of their historical development, in which they were transferred from theology to the theory of the state, whereby, for example, the omnipotent God became the omnipotent lawgiver, but also because of the systematic structure, the recognition of which is necessary for a sociological consideration of these concepts. The exception in jurisprudence is analogous to the miracle in theology. So this sense of decision, not being based on experience or reference or reason, but on a decision that is not necessarily rational or anything else. It is a decision based on the personal preference of whoever is given that power. This becomes a little bit tricky within the democratic context. And let me just ask you this. Where does sovereignty lie in the United States?
In the theory, it rests with the people.
In theory, I would also look at the structure of our government and try. I've thought about this a lot since starting to teach this stuff, but
Would states' rights be a big issue with that one?
the states' rights are balanced with the Constitution as well. So, yeah, I mean, so there's definitely, so that brings up the point of ultimately power is balanced. So saying that the power is with the people is a basic democratic concept. There are plenty of arguments against that, I guess, of how it actually plays out. But that is in the sense of all the other structures are voted in ultimately and have that process within it. But yeah, any other thoughts? Any other thoughts about powers in the United States that are not voted in by the people? Yeah, the Supreme Court. And that is... What's fascinating is if you're speaking to a particularly conservative argument, maybe 5 years ago, maybe less so now, but they would side with Jefferson in being really critical of the Supreme Court. Jefferson did not want that much power given to the Supreme Court, and it's actually because of that early decision by Chief Justice John Marshall on Marbury v. Madison that established judicial review, which is not in the Constitution, that ends up giving the Supreme Court so much power. But yeah, I mean, that's even arguable then, because ultimately the Supreme Court is deciding what's in line with the Constitution or not, and they actually don't have any force with them, which has also led to problems, because then you end up with things like Jim Crow, where you have all these years where the Constitution is not being enforced and protected. The Supreme Court has said it is a problem, and we're just going to throw up our hands because there's nothing to do about it, unless you want to do another civil war. So that leads to problems. But anyways, so that was just an aside. I think that's an interesting question, because particularly if you're going to ask students, particularly younger students, the more you're going to hear this, they're going to say, oh, it's the president. And the president really doesn't have that level of power. And ultimately, if you're looking at the Constitution, where does most of the power lie according to the Constitution? Definitely not the Supreme Court. Definitely not the Supreme Court. It lies with Congress. Congress is going to be the most direct aspect of representational democracy within the Constitution. It's supposed to all be about them. And of course, all those questions about how it's broken up and how the power is distributed between the Senate and the House all cause issues, but they all cause issues because that's where most of the power resides. Schmitt's argument about that kind of system is that if Congress has most or all of the power and they end up stalemating and not coming to reasonable conclusions to these questions of law, then you have this kind of exceptional moment, and that leads to people getting frustrated enough that they feel the need to take up arms against their own government, which was January 6th a prelude, you know? Yeah. Moving forward. So we'll get a little bit into what he means by decisionism, and that really defines Schmitt's understanding of politics. He says the existence of the state is undoubted proof of its superiority over the validity of the legal norm. This is a lot of language, sorry, now that I'm reading it in public. We'll dig into it. The decision frees itself from all normative ties and becomes, in the true sense, absolute. The state suspends the law in the exception on the basis of its right of self-preservation, as one would say. So what he's challenging here is this sense that our legal processes are ultimate, and instead is pointing toward this sovereign decision. And we can develop what that means as we move forward. And this is his argument about democracy then. So he says, democracy is the expression of a political relativism and a scientific orientation that are liberated from miracles and dogmas and based on human understanding and critical doubt. Just to clarify, he views that as a negative. So when he's saying that democracy is this expression of scientific orientation that is liberated from miracles and dogmas, he says that is a mistake. Because ultimately, this idea that we're gonna do these studies, And we're going to say, okay, this is the most reasonable thing to do, and that's what we're going to do, and that's what we're going to base our law on. First of all, how often does that work? One of the reasons we could explain why that doesn't work is Schmidt. Because ultimately, these definitions of laws and what we're moving toward and what we're trying to accomplish are not dependent upon science alone, particularly because, just as an aside for a moment, people are not as rational as we like to think they are. We don't make all of our decisions by thinking, oh, this is the best thing. Oh, maybe I need to check those proofs. No, it's not like that. We're moved by our gut or our heart rather than thinking through these processes. So...
Isn't there a kind of a separation of church and state in that statement there? I mean, miracles and dogmas, that the democracy would not be ruled by the church?
Yes, so this is translating this into this concept of sovereignty, though. So he's comparing this, miracles and dogmas are going to be comparable to this decision, this sovereign decision. So the sovereign decision is not based upon science and human understanding and critical doubt. It's saying, we're doing this because it benefits us. Because it doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be good for the whole world for it to be beneficial to us. And that's kind of what he's saying. Whoever's making these decisions, it's supposed to be about self-preservation or even enriching. Thoughts about that? Oh, yes. He agrees with Hobbes. Yeah.
I think that's the problem for most moderns, right? It seems like the further we get along, we have a higher and higher anthropology of ourselves. And, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I agree. I have a very low anthropology. I have a very low view of human nature. I think we're self-centered. I think we're clouded by doubleness. I think we're prideful. We automatically go to instincts of superbia. I think all of those things are inherent in us. So it makes sense, that you might need something above you to kind of correct that a little bit. You know what I mean? But the problem is who's that going to be when it gets into the political arena? I thought the most powerful thing that's been on the whole screen is this idea that all of these political theories are secularized theologies, right? And so that means that the way that you comprehend God as an entity and what God's function is, right, can be really easily determined to reason out at a political level. And I don't know, that worries me a little bit. You know what I mean? It worries me a little bit.
Yeah.
Especially given the flaws of human nature that are inherent, right? I think it's got to have some sort of check and balance, right? I don't know what that is. I mean, maybe that's the beauty of the American political system, is that there's supposed to be checks and balances for that kind of stuff, right? But I don't know. I mean, it makes sense, right? I mean, I get what he's saying, but I don't know. There's just something about it that feels really dangerous to me.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. It's dangerous. Yeah, no doubt about that.
On the surface, it's not. Like even if in his mind there's an element of truth to it, the reality of boots on the ground is another thing, right? It can be twisted pretty quickly, and I guess that's what scares me about it.
Oh, yes. So maybe to answer that a little bit and to complicate things, just to complicate things a little bit further. Yeah, just to help you out.
It means how can we complicate it?
I mean, you study theology. You study theology.
I could say theology.
That's right. By the time we finish, you'll have everything put back together and you'll be good to go. I hope I don't mess you up. Sorry. All right. No, I don't think that's gonna happen. So there you go. Two complicating factors of that. First is that I'll talk a little bit about Barth here. One of the things that I find fascinating about Barth, going back to Karl Barth, who's the theologian that opposed the Third Reich and who wrote some very fascinating theology that I continue to dig into, but he was not a pacifist. And one of the most interesting things that I've kind of he doesn't lean super far into that as much, but someone who does from the same era is C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis was also not a pacifist, and at least one of his interests was in building up a group of future Christians who would be prepared to fight the Nazis in the future. And I think that's the point of relation. I think we might vehemently disagree with Schmidt's morals, but that doesn't make his political statement invalid.
No, I think it makes sense. I mean, I'm not denying the validity of it. Logically, I mean, I can see what he's saying. But I mean, even C.S. Lewis said, that war doesn't bring out anything new in a human being. It only magnifies what was already there, right? I mean, he holds this very low view of human nature, which is why I think, and his experiences in World War I pressed him to never want this to happen again. And I think he knew that. And
But I think,
for me, C.S. Lewis, I feel, would rail against this, right? Because he would see this as a very slippery slope into tyranny.
but see, I would caution him with that on this exact point. C.S. Lewis is going to have an understanding of who the enemy is.
Yeah, he is.
Yeah, I mean, so if C.S. Lewis wants to be able to determine that, and therefore to protect the polis, you have to be able to make that statement. And that's something that makes us queasy. But that's the problem. I mean, and I think C.S. Lewis would be screaming about that. I would hope he would. I mean, I hope he wouldn't.
I can see what you're saying. I think that's...
So let's move forward a little bit. So we're going to complicate this. I'm not just being pro Schmidt here, so don't get me wrong on that. So one of the primary critiques of Schmidt that we'll look at comes from Chantal Mouffe, who is a Belgian political theorist. And she has this argument for this understanding of agonistic pluralism, but she's going to really read and critique Schmidt, but in this kind of critique that recognizes the validity of his claim at the same time. So she writes, Schmidt claims that liberalism negates democracy and democracy negates liberalism. And I'll explain that here in just a second a little bit further. And parliamentary democracy, since it consists in the articulation between democracy and liberalism, is therefore a non-viable regime. So when we're thinking about liberalism, this is this understanding that all humans by nature are free, equal, and self-sufficient, and therefore there's limits on what we can do to another human and it is a guide to how we interact with them. But there's this real emphasis on all human beings. And the real contrast there that Schmidt gets into is that democracy is not about all, it's about some. Democracy is a determined group of people. There is a demos. This group of people who are making these decisions, is not everybody. So just take that, I want to take that idea for just a second. And there's a lot of really problematic ways that people have been excluded from political rights in the United States, but are all people given the same political rights in the United States? And should they be? Who is excluded from political rights? One of the largest groups.
The black people.
Felons.
Currently,
Prison.
today.
Prison.
Felons, potentially, even broader than that. Larger group.
Of non-voting with the black people.
Children.
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
Children. Yeah, so there's a recognition that should a 5-year-old be able to have an equal vote as me? No. Why? Why though? Why should a 5-year-old not have an equal vote as me, or as you?
And develop themselves.
They haven't developed. They need to learn and they need to grow, right? So there's an understanding there within that then that there is something that a human is working and growing toward that they have to develop. So that's a little bit of going back to that telos sense that we got to figure out a little bit because we have an idea of what a human should be and a way of kind of thinking through that. And there's a lot of problematic ways. And yes, the history of civil rights and voting rights is a huge problem and a way of excluding people that depends upon again, principles of defining and excluding some human beings that's really problematic in so many ways. And the same logic was applied to women, and for the same reasons. In fact, women and people of color were excluded as being not sufficiently rational, all under that same kind of guise. So then you had, the difference would be male children grow out of it, and everybody else doesn't. So we have an understanding then that even in America, even today, even within a just system, some are excluded. Who actually makes up the demos, who is deciding our government and what laws should be enacted, doesn't include everybody. And that's the point that's being drawn up here. So when he says that liberalism negates democracy, he is making this claim that these can't coexist because you don't make policy, you don't make laws for everyone. You make them for your people. And that becomes really problematic when you start talking about nationalism, and particularly in this development of nationalism that we see with the Nazis, this emphasis on we're helping these people and we're opposing those people. Really messy, but at the same time, you can't make laws for the whole world. You're not making laws for the whole world. You're not making laws for every human being. You're making laws for a specific group of people in a specific place. And if we lose sight of that, things get tricky real fast. And it is incredibly problematic at the same time.
I mean, wouldn't you say that part of what he's saying there is kind of, I mean, look, we don't, you know, it's like Friedman said, you know, the world's flat now, you know what I mean? Like, the world is changed, right? Like, I mean, we can't say this, but you're right, like, we can't make, so you say we can't make laws for the whole world, but we do. We do, because if we don't, then we don't have international trade, right? Like, there has to be things on a global level now, simply because of the way the world operates in the 21st century, even if it's just at a pure economic level.
Ooh.
Right? You know what I mean? And so
We'll come back to that.
but you see where I'm going with it? Like, I'm wondering if his time and his place made this make a lot of sense, whereas now our challenge is that we can't think in an isolationist point of view anymore. We can't just think about our people anymore, because the world is too interconnected at a global level for us to do that and survive.
I think, but even within that, you're going to make laws, sorry, it's not your, but we would make laws that affect us directly and might indirectly affect others.
Well, I mean, that's what tariffs are, right? I mean, this is the whole debate about tariffs right now. I get that, but I don't know, I just feel like this goes to this extreme that kind of breeds this isolationist mindset, right? Like, my people, America, right? Like, you know, screw everybody else, we're about America. But it, you know, it doesn't work like that.
So let's pause for a second and move a little bit further. Yeah, no, you're good. You'd really,
what I'm saying.
I think you'd really like Moof for what we're about to get into.
Okay.
I think she's getting exactly to what you're describing. She's going to describe this understanding of agonistic pluralism, and she's going to define this in this way. So she's going to describe antagonism as a struggle between enemies in that kind of Hobbesian sense, while agonism is a struggle between adversaries. So this is speaking a little bit within, but I'll draw it into what you were saying here in a moment, Rev Jerry. But she says, we can therefore reformulate our problem by saying that envisaged from the perspective of agonistic pluralism, the aim of democratic politics is to transform antagonism into agonism. So this is trying to change that kind of language exactly that you were talking about. That might be expanding into a bit of a global conversation that Moof maybe isn't talking about right there. But ultimately, what she's working at is this understanding of democratic paradox, where you're holding in at the same time this understanding of liberalism and democracy, and you have to recognize that they don't entirely fit, and you have to make determinations about how those function in a given time. That means when you're making policy, you have to recognize that it is for a specific people, one way or another, and it affects others. So that would be the kind of paradoxical aspect there, and exactly what you were describing. I want to pause on some of the economic things here a little bit, because we're going to get into some more problematic elements of that here in a minute with political economy. And in fact, Schmidt and to a lesser degree Moof are going to be critical of that kind of melding of politics with economics it really disrupts our understanding of politics today. But you're bringing up an interesting argument that I want to continue to make room for. But this understanding specifically is being able to recognize within your own society that you can push against someone else as an adversary without making them an enemy. And making room for that is how you kind of work toward this sense of this paradoxical relation between the all of liberalism and the sum of democracy. And that's how you can make room for that. But it also recognizes at the same time that there will be some that want to destroy that system and determine some as enemies within. And that is fatal if you don't step up together with your adversaries to stop that. So keeping that in mind. So what was I saying we were going to get into there? Oh yeah, so we'll come back around. So we can go through this pretty quickly. Actually, let's go ahead and we're going to jump forward a little bit. I was going to get into some of the Levinas stuff, but we can maybe return to that here in a moment. But since Reverend Jerry brought up those elements, I want to talk about it. This is a key breakdown, and you're bringing in an interesting perspective that I want to make room for. It might help me grow as a thinker, so I'm very open to that. But this going back to how Aristotle defines humans as homo politicus. Sorry, I didn't mention that, but man is a political animal. He's going to use this term homo politicus, which simply means political animal, or political human, versus this understanding of homo economicus. And Aristotle is going to have a very specific way of distinguishing the polis, or how these kind of political decisions are made, versus the oikon, or the household. And he's going to make those distinctions for reasons that become problematic, definitely. But this kind of distinguishes out trade, obviously dealing with a very different era in history, from those decisions about how the polis is run, and particular decisions about what the threats are to a society. But what we see with this turn to homo economicus after World War II is defining human beings on what you produce and what you consume. More or less, maybe that's an overstatement, but this is coming from the particularly libertarian institute, the von Mises Institute, which I don't know, anybody familiar with that? Have you any particular ties to it or whatever? I don't want to like step on toes necessarily, but this is a contemporary libertarian, or even what would be termed neoliberal conception of humanity. And it is a competing understanding. And this is one of the fascinating debates in political philosophy now, is as we push more and more political decisions on what is effective or ineffective for the economy, what political decisions are we losing? And what are we losing by making all decisions economic? And we can get into that a little bit. Reverend Jerry, did you have more to add with that at all, or questions? Okay. So to give a little bit of background with this, this is an idea coming from World War I, from the end of World War I and then moving forward, was in order to avoid violent confrontation, you want more and more emphasis upon trade and building these kind of economic connections that would allow for tensions to arise and be dealt with economically rather than through violence. But as we see, I mean, at the end of World War II, there's immediately entering into the age of mutually assured destruction with the introduction of nuclear warfare. But economics becomes a way of doing a lot of damage too. I mean, once you start talking about large-scale famine and lack of trade causing issues like that, it becomes a different conversation. But there's this tension between political decision versus these market forces. And getting back to the sense of we're essentially economical as far as how we go about the world as human beings. There's this particular libertarian influence that emphasizes that there should not be government intervention within the economy. You're familiar with that language at all? This is pretty typical. I mean, this is So von Mises ends up being highly influential for both Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. So we're getting into some political economy stuff, and I'm very interested in y'all's thoughts on that. If you push back, I'm very open to that. But giving a bit of a layout of how this is working. This comes back to the forefront really after 2008 with as a kind of a response to Francis Fukuyama. Are you familiar with Francis Fukuyama? He wrote this text basically saying that, oh, we've reached the end of history, meaning we've reached the culmination of humanity, and it's actually a reference to Hegel in a really particular weird way, but he ultimately is saying that modern capitalism has won, and because of the fall of the Soviet Union. He's writing this in 91, sorry, so the 2008 is a jump forward, but he's writing that we've reached the end of history, and everything's going to be good moving forward, more or less. I mean, it's going to move toward this progress, and that really comes to be questioned in 2008 with the Great Recession and all of the turmoil that followed and has followed since then, and it's led to this kind of resurgence of Marxist economic critique. Yeah, and I can give you some specific references for that, particularly if you're interested in this. Wendy Brown has some really good stuff. Check out her stuff. It's a pretty interesting critique, particularly from those specific time periods. But you're seeing more of this criticism of this neoliberal regime that has kind of taken over things. So it's more and more a question of what is going to maximize profits rather than lead to decisions about what is good or bad. Thoughts on that?
Would a microcosm of that be being experienced right now in terms of whether or not Mercedes is whether they're going to develop an organism for the people who work there, fighting against the governors who are saying don't organize? Is that a microcosm of what you're talking about?
That's an element of it for sure. But I mean, even prior to that, what would be more particular to this would be, again, going back to these economic principles from this more libertarian or neoliberal perspective, the market is king. The market is ultimately sovereign, and that's what should be guiding things. And there's a desire for government non-intervention. So the government shouldn't be tweaking things to change whatever. But from that perspective then, if the market is ultimately what should be guiding things, let's just say manufacturers want to move their manufacturing industry to another country, that is good. They're looking for the cheapest labor possible, and then they're going to go find it, and that benefits you as a consumer in America because you got cheaper goods to buy.
Benefits that economy. I mean, this is what fascinates me about Elon Musk and everybody, oh, his deals with China. And I'm like, okay, you understand what happened, right? Like, when Tesla first began, it almost tanked. I mean, it was this close to tanking. And the reason it didn't tank is because he went to China. And he made some deals with their government in order to put a plant there. And he became the largest manufacturer of EVs in the world. And now, fast forward about 10 or 15 years later, and because he was in that economy and the kind of technological innovation that he drove in China, now EDC, which is a China-based EV manufacturer, has outpaced him. You see what I mean? And so it's like you're saying, like the market forces drove him over there, and then it drove that economy itself to make technological advancements to the point where they're now outpacing him.
Yes.
In manufacturing, right? And I think that's what's fascinating to me about this is that, if you let the market do what it wants to do, it creates its own set of morals based on profit margin, right? And that's the inherent danger of it, because that's not always... Yes.
And just pausing for that for a second. I mean, so moving away from Tesla for a moment, because I'm not sure of all these specifics necessarily, but with multiple large industries, the prices we are able to have and to purchase things at a relatively low expense is often due to largely unpaid labor elsewhere. And those companies have gone to those other nations because there are not laws protecting workers in those places. I mean, so issues in textiles has been one of the biggest problems because in places like was it Bangladesh, there was some really horrible fires and stuff because they didn't have regulations in those places, and we have been benefiting from lower prices because of that largely unpaid and unsafe labor. So the moral element has been completely removed for those market forces. And from this libertarian perspective, that's great.
Well, it's like, so like the question I always ask people, right, you know, capitalism it's a system, right? You know what I mean? You gotta remove the morals, because look, be honest, the person who cures cancer isn't gonna do it from some altruistic point of view. They're gonna do it because it's gonna make them rich. You know what I mean? And so from that view, capitalism has these unintended consequences that can produce some really amazing outputs, right?
I see what you're saying.
I think it's wrong to assume that those outputs, even if they're great for the whole world, come from an altruistic and moral superior place, right?
I understand what you're saying. I understand. I mean, but what's kind of the missing piece here is
Regulation.
well, but also a whole lot of people's lives that were completely upturned and ruined by those market machinations. And the question is, should that be something that we want to keep doing? And particularly, so if the idea is let those market forces rule and don't worry about things like regulation or our ethics involved in that. That's the question, and I have a hard time as a philosopher and as a Christian saying, I just want to let it go, and I can wink away a few hundred deaths here and there, or a few thousand deaths here and there. I think that's tricky, to say the least. I mean, within that, there is this also kind of this nationalist problem of, we want to build up so we can take that back and have power, and that needs to be balanced really nicely with the ethics somehow. But that also leads us to this problem of now you've got a whole bunch of people in the Rust Belt who are pissed off and struggling. And are they wrong to be pissed off? I don't know if they're wrong to be pissed off. But what I do know is that they were left in a really bad situation. And we can just say, pick yourself up by your bootstraps and move on, because that's capitalism, baby. And to some degree, many of them, that is their approach, whether they state it that way or not. And I say this as, reflecting on many of my family members who have those kind of perspectives. But I want to have compassion for them, and I don't want to just say, sucks to suck. But
I guess where I'm coming from is it shocks me when they see these consequences and this selective outrage about it, it gets me, because what did you expect? You know what I mean? Like if you can't blame capitalism as a system or even a political philosophy or a market philosophy for this problem, because this is what it does. So don't act all surprised and shocked when there's 5-year-olds over in Bangladesh making your Nike shoes in a sweatshop. This is what happens, right? And so you're going to gripe to me about government intervention, but then you're going to gripe to me about this, and it's selective outrage. And I'm like, you can't have your cake and eat it too.
I see what you're saying. I see what you're saying. Yeah. So
and even in my own industry in telecom, I can remember in the early 2000s when my company, Nokia, then it was Alcatel Network Systems, made the shift to contract manufacturing. And we shifted most of our manufacturing down to Guadalajara, Mexico, where there is a gigantic manufacturing facility by a company named Sanmina. And they make products for dozens and dozens of industries, right? And people got outraged about it. And I'm like, really? Have you used your iPhone lately? Because all the technology that iPhone hooks into is only made at a feasible price because we're making it in Mexico and shipping it up through Nogales, right? And when you go, and then I went to Nogales, and I went down there, right? And I'm like, there are good working conditions down here. I mean, these people, they want this manufacturing plant here. So I think in some cases it works, in some cases it doesn't. I'm just making the argument that I just don't like selective outrage. I like if you're gonna turn a system loose, then understand the consequences of that, and either do something about it and regulate it and be okay with that regulation, or don't.
So I hear what you're saying. Yeah. So I think you would be speaking to someone who's leaning in this kind of libertarian, neoliberal perspective and saying, hey, the only way to make this work is to regulate. And I would agree with that. However, to answer another part of what you were saying, though, of you need to attack the system as a whole, we're seeing a large group of younger people that are leaning into pretty dated and fairly anachronistic understandings of political theory with communism specifically, in order to say, I want to scrap the whole. And yes, you would say to them also, you don't understand how these systems are working, and you would have to sacrifice an awful lot. Part of what I would be arguing is, yeah, sacrifice an awful lot. This is an unsustainable situation. But those things are not happening in the discourse, and that's part of the problem. So yeah, to get what you're saying on one side, the reason why you're seeing hammer and sickle stuff everywhere with kids is that they're saying, I'm done with this system. The phrase, there is no ethical consumption under capitalism, is something that young people are taking pretty seriously. And oftentimes that's leading toward this kind of revolutionary violence that doesn't have any thought behind it necessarily. It just wants to overthrow. Because there's not really an understanding of what communism looks like, what did or did not work well in the Soviet Union, what Marx was talking about. They don't want to actually read this stuff. They just want to have an avenue for expressing rage. And that's dangerous to me, even if I might agree with some of that critique. So keeping that, but what you're saying on this other side to these kind of libertarian concepts, I completely agree with, and it leads to some real limitations and problems. Leaning into this understanding of government intervention. So this is coming from, I ended up teaching an economics class at this very conservative school, and I wanted to toe the line with it because I was already on the outs anyway. So anyways, I can tell you more about that privately or another time or whatever, but I ended up reading stuff from Thomas Sowell and Friedrich Bastiat, who Bastiat's a 18th century, 19th century political theorist who was really like the political economist who was the father of libertarianism. This is not a reference for this crowd probably, but there's like a kind of a meme understanding of libertarianism as socialism is when the government does stuff, but Bastiat basically argues that. So government intervention at all is anything the government is doing that has anything to do with economics. And the problem with that is that you have to completely ignore history to say that ever existed. The best example is tariffs. I mean, if you go back to Alexander Hamilton and the building up, his ideas for building up the American economy and making it stable long term was to enact tariffs on those European goods, particularly from Britain, because they're already started the Industrial Revolution and American manufacturing needed time to catch up, and that made a lot of sense for that. But it is opposed to these principles because it's not letting the market really be the only force. You have government intervention in it. So if you end up taking this libertarian perspective far enough, then, I mean, ultimately, and maybe you can weigh in on this a little bit, Reverend Jerry, but this ultimate perspective is anti-state itself. It is, in its essence, anarchist. It wants no state, period. Which leads to some interesting overlap with certain Marxist theorists because Bakunin was also a Marxist theorist, and that's where you get this kind of leftist anarchism as well, but they look very different. But it's this understanding that basically corporations and large corporations will determine how we should live. And those are private entities, so we don't have a say in them, and that's how it should be, ultimately. I find that terrifying in a different way. But sorry. Okay, so this all comes back up in the forefront of the public imagination in 2008 with that recession and the Occupy Wall Street movement. And then, of course, kind of a branch off of that later was the Tea Party movement. And it's become a mess. And I think Rev. Jerry's arguments about that would be probably more applicable to a more conservative argument, perspective of, hey, if you have this understanding of how we should treat people, then there has to be some limits on what a market can do and choose. And to some degree, having cheap products has to be less important than people not dying at work.
Well, and maybe the basic core of human nature is not consumption.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
that's the flaw, right? I mean, it's like when George W. Bush stands on an aircraft carrier, the towers go down, and what's the first thing he says for people to do? Buy stuff, right? You know what I mean? Maybe that's where it begins.
The way you phrase that, I just pictured the mission accomplished thing, but...
Well, no, I misstated myself. I just remember I think it was right after the towers fell, like it was shortly after that. He gives an address, and he says, go back to normal life, and he defines normal life as going to the mall and buying stuff, right? It's this underlying idea that we're entities that consume, which means we're entities that need to produce, and that's how prosperity and happiness is defined.
Right.
And that works really well with things like meritocracy and the building up of an elite class, right? Because somebody's got to control that machine. Maybe that's where you're going. I just can't wait to see what you say about James Cone. So,
so it'll be very brief. I was planning to spend more time, and maybe we'll have an opportunity to do that a little bit more thoroughly. With this understanding of production of elites, particularly complaints about there being this kind of political elite or social elite, these are produced by the system itself, as Reverend Jerry just said. So that's one of the things that we're not really taken seriously a lot of times when we have these kind of conversations that really just stay at that surface level of, oh, why are the elites controlling all these things? Well, we've developed a system that's supposed to be based on meritocracy. So if you do these certain things and you earn these things, then you get to be in that upper echelon, and then you get to make those decisions. That's how we've decided to make this work. So to critique that, you have to critique the system, but that's not something that is happening, or critiquing the system even in a subtler sense of how do we help it rather than destroy it. But this leads to this kind of shrieking American class too, because it's this building of wealth over time and this building of access to resources as well. That even as someone who has worked up from the trailer park to get a PhD, I didn't have those same opportunities as others. I was never going to go to Yale, not without having a horrible debt and probably going to the divinity school at best. But that just wasn't an option for me. And again, that gets back to our idea of to what extent are we free and equal? I mean, what are we doing here? And what are we supposed to be protecting with these individual rights that are the kind of substance of our whole society? What are we actually providing opportunity to if you have this passed down and there's no way in? That's a real problem.
But you did that. How did you do that? How did you get from here to there? So you had the opportunity to do it.
I have had the opportunity. So wasn't expecting that question. I would say, first of all, I'm not quite in that. I mean, there's still places that I can't go, certainly.
What do you mean?
Why?
I mean, I'm never going to get a job at Harvard.
Oh, that kind of
Yeah.
No, but you got from the trailer park to a PhD.
Yeah, I mean, so it is. There's a certain meritocratic element that is good, and
Yeah, I mean, you had I don't know if that was your goal to do that, but you made it whatever from here to there, that's quite the jump.
yes.
It's less and less, though, today than it was even in the 70s.
What's left?
You weren't alive in the 70s.
No,
Yeah.
no. Yes.
1980, things changed in America, in my view. So.
Interesting. I'd like to explore that maybe a little bit later, but or another time. But maybe just after class, real quick. I'd love to ask you a couple questions about that. But part of it is I've had certain privilege that is very clear. I mean, I'm a white man, and I'm a Christian, and ultimately I've been able to work up because of that. I got scholarships to Dallas Baptist and Truett Seminary, Baylor, and being interested in Christianity was part of the thing that helped me get my position at DU as well. I mean, there was a lot of element to that I had to work my butt off for, but
that was your goal, and you did it, so you could do it here in the U.S.
Yes. I'm also not one of those ones complaining about elites necessarily. Sorry, I don't want to make this overly personal with that.
I can complain about production until I'm producing something and I want people to have it. I mean, there's that double bind.
Oh yeah.
You know,
I mean,
we're an islands ranch. We're not.
yeah. I mean, it's one of those fascinating things of even talking about economics or even teaching economics. I like to talk about Shark Tank because it's really easy to look at some of the political problems. Because you're looking at Shark Tank, and if a price point is too high for a product, what's the first thing they're going to tell you to do? I got this manufacturer in China I'm going to hook you up with, and we're going to get it done for half the price. Yeah. And then you see some people try to take an ethical stance, and they're going to say, no, I want manufacturing in the United States. And they're like, okay, cool. The only way that is possible is if your price point is low enough to be able to sell it, to be able to produce it and sell it at a reasonable rate. But that's that principle of the ethics are less important. And they have to be within those market circumstances, for sure. I mean, that's how the system works. But you can't critique that without critiquing it. I mean, I think that was Reverend Jerry's point ultimately of we're either gonna critique this whole or quit complaining about stuff that is a natural output of the system we've constructed. Yeah. So quick comments on some of these individuals. Walter Rauschenbusch was a Baptist minister, actually, at the turn of the 20th century, who argued for the social gospel, which I bring him up partially because there's absolutely socialist elements that are trying to, and socialist meaning that there are social limits on some of these economic factors that should be put in place so that you're ensuring that people at the bottom of society are keeping up to some degree. And that the what is it? What I'm looking for? Living, how good you're living keeps up at a reasonable rate, and you don't have a horribly unequal society. The Roosevelts, I bring them up as well because Teddy Roosevelt is talked about a lot again in conservative circles, and I mean, being a Republican and everything before the party significantly changed, but he ran on this platform of a square deal. Do you know what the square deal was? He was arguing that the deal between labor and capital had gone the way of capital over and over and over again, including these tariffs and everything else within recent history and going way back. And he wanted to square that with labor, to have a better deal for working class people. That's what Teddy Roosevelt ran on. And then FDR, his platform was the New Deal. And that was that same language, trying to get a new deal to help the laboring class. This kind of critique of society you see picked up again with Cohn. I would reference, and if we have time at some point later, I'll reference some of his texts, particularly his text, Martin and Malcolm in America. It's a really excellent, just really excellent outline of political and some political economic issues reflecting on Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. And Cohn really views himself as being influenced by both, even though he is a Christian theologian, but also a liberation theologian. So these are getting into more liberation thought. So it's influenced by this political economic critique. And that's where I was going with that. We're not going to spend as much time on that as I want to, but Gustavo Gutierrez, also another individual that's influenced by Marxist critique, and also Karl Barth. Cohn was also influenced by Karl Barth. One of the reasons why Barth is not particularly liked all the time by conservative sources, despite being really rigid on his theology. Not rigid, but really specific and faithful in his theology. But Gutierrez is the Latin American, really one of the major voices of Latin American liberation theology. So he's arguing for the working class and argues that God has a preferential option for the poor. It's a pretty interesting analysis, and again has this kind of critique of political economy with it. I bring up Cannon because Katie Cannon is also in this tradition, but she is actually, she's representative, at least in a way, if not 100% actually, a representative of this kind of third wave feminism of critiquing these liberative movements, but with this intersectional understanding of not leaving room for women particularly within the civil rights movement. But they're all within this kind of critique of systems of society that are influenced by certain Marxist perspectives as well as Christian theology. So a couple final thoughts before we move on, or before we end up. Just to leave you with then, and if you want to hang out for a couple minutes at the end, I would love to hear more from you, but is a shared telos or teleology, the sense of human purpose and meaning, necessary for a good and just society? What should the relationship be between democratic government and the economy? And what room is there for coming to these decisions as opposed to having things determined either by scientific observation or market forces? What's the relationship between democratic government and those systems of thought? How should individuals in the church engage democratic society, particularly in light of this understanding of political economy? And what is or should be the relationship between theological ethics and democratic government? So this is getting back to that theme that we've seen from the beginning of what is our being shaped by the church and the Bible and our tradition. What should that relationship with our government be? So, thoughts to leave you with. And we will go ahead and conclude, but I would love to hear thoughts if you want to have some more conversation.